Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a century where alliances were inked in candlelight, and a crown could rest on the head of someone barely tall enough to reach the table at supper. A time when marriage was not about affection or choice, but about borders, armies, and treaties written in the cold language of survival. And at the heart of tonight's story is a child, just 6 years old, married to a king 29 years her senior, a man who saw her not as a companion, but as a link in the long unbroken chain of dynastic politics. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy wandering with me through these quiet corners of history. And in the comments, tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see the little map of our listeners spread across the world. So, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, a slow walk through stone corridors and shadowed council chambers, into the quiet, heavy world of medieval royalty. And we begin, as all such stories do, not with the bride herself, but with a kingdom quietly waiting for an heir. The kingdom lay stretched across a landscape of rolling hills and winding rivers, its borders defined less by natural features than by the fragile agreements inked in script that few could read. From the cold coasts where the wind seemed to carry the taste of salt even in summer, to the fertile valleys where the soil was dark and heavy with centuries of cultivation, this was a realm both proud and weary. It had seen decades of war and uneasy peace, of banners raised and lowered, of villages burned in the name of one cause or another, only to be rebuilt with the same patient stubbornness of those who had no choice but to live upon that land. The king who now sat upon its throne was neither young enough to be rash nor old enough to be dismissed, but he carried upon his shoulders the weight of a crown whose stability depended on more than just his own lifetime. He had inherited the throne in the aftermath of his father's long reign, a reign marked by bitter skirmishes at the border, and a cautious dance with neighboring kingdoms. The treaties that held his realm together were like threads pulled too tightly, capable of snapping if strained even a little too far. The king had, in the years since his coronation, worked to strengthen those threads, weaving them into something resembling a tapestry of peace. But there remained a shadow over his rule, a question whispered not in his presence, but in the quieter moments of council: what would become of the kingdom when he was gone? For all his efforts in war and diplomacy, the king had yet to secure the most basic assurance of dynastic continuity, a legitimate heir. Without one, the crown would pass into the hands of distant relatives, perhaps even foreign claimants, each backed by their own ambitions and armies. The memory of succession disputes still lingered in the minds of his subjects, not as distant history but as a lived reality from just a generation earlier, when the realm had nearly torn itself apart over the question of who should rule. A child born directly of the king's blood would silence many of those doubts. Without such a child, they would grow louder. Marriage in the medieval mind was less a matter of companionship than of governance. Alliances were built not on trust, which could be broken, but on kinship, which could not be undone once sealed by the church. The king, though unmarried, was far from without offers. Envoys came bearing proposals written in formal Latin, sealed with wax, their messages carried across mountain passes and stormy seas. Each proposal was accompanied by a litany of promises, dowries measured not only in coin, but in soldiers, ships, and fortified towns. Yet none of these matches had been accepted, for reasons that were often more complicated than they appeared. Some were unsuitable because their families were embroiled in conflicts the king wished to avoid. Others offered little in the way of strategic advantage, their lands too distant or their influence too slight. And there were those whose political worth was high, but whose ties to rival factions made them dangerous to bring into the court. The king was careful, deliberate, unwilling to bind himself and his kingdom to a choice that might bring more trouble than it solved. But time was passing, and with it, the patience of those who looked to him for security. It was in this climate of quiet urgency that the search for a bride took on new intensity. Advisors spoke of regions where noble houses had young daughters of marriageable age, or at least of betrothal age, for in truth, the line between the two could be alarmingly thin. The church sanctioned unions that today might seem strange. Their blessings offered less for the sake of the individuals than for the sake of the stability such marriages might bring. And so, Among the many names whispered in council, there began to emerge one that seemed both promising and unthreatening, a girl far younger than any the king had yet considered, but whose family's position made her an ideal choice for a politically tidy union. Her father's lands bordered those of the king's allies, offering a convenient bridge between territories. Her family was loyal to the church, their wealth respectable but not so great as to inspire envy. Most importantly, they were willing, more than willing, to enter into a bond that would tie their bloodline directly to the throne. That the girl was still in the earliest years of childhood was noted but not treated as an obstacle. In the world of royal politics, a bride's age mattered far less than her lineage. The marriage could be solemnized in ceremony, with the expectation that its full duties would be delayed until she was older. Such arrangements were not uncommon, and in some courts they were considered prudent, giving both families years to prepare for the eventual responsibilities of the union. Yet even with such practical reasoning, the choice carried with it an undeniable strangeness. The image of the tall, broad-shouldered king beside a child scarcely beyond the nursery was one that would not easily fade from the minds of those who witnessed it. Still, to the men of the council and the clerics who would bless the union, such considerations were trifles compared to the assurance of an heir and the cementing of a political alliance. In their minds, the marriage would not be the end of the kingdom's dignity, but its safeguard. As the idea solidified into a plan, letters began to pass discreetly between the two courts. They spoke not of love, nor even of the individuals involved, but of terms, the size of the dowry, the rights to certain lands, the order of precedence at ceremonies. These were the details that mattered, the points upon which agreements were built and kingdoms preserved. And while the king reviewed these terms with the same measured care he applied to treaties, somewhere in the distant halls of a noble household, the child who would one day be called queen remained unaware of the currents already pulling her life toward the throne. The decision, once made, was not announced with fanfare. Instead, it spread in murmurs, traveling along the slow paths of medieval communication, from court officials to noble households, from noble households to merchants, from merchants to the marketplaces, where news was always accompanied by embellishment. By the time the agreement was publicly declared, it was less a surprise than the confirmation of something many already suspected. The king would marry, and the bride would be a child from a distant land, chosen not for her beauty or wit, but for the quiet efficiency with which she could link two houses into one. And so, in the year before her birth, the pieces of her future were already being set in place, the alliances mapped out, the ceremonies imagined, the roles assigned. She had not yet taken her first breath, yet her place in the grand machinery of the realm was already fixed. In the months to come, the negotiations would give way to preparations, and in a quiet chamber far from the royal court, she would be born into a world that had already decided what she was meant to be. And while the kingdom's banners still flew above its stone walls, and the king continued to sit upon his throne, there was, beneath it all, a sense that the story of its future had just begun, a story that would lead from her first days in her father's house to the long winding path toward the crown. Far from the marble-floored halls of the king's residence, in a quieter and less politically charged corner of the world, a child came into being. The lands of her birth were softer in their contours than the fortress-laden hills of the royal seat, shaped by centuries of farming rather than by sieges and campaigns. Fields stretched in ordered strips, bordered by low stone walls and hedges that turned green in spring and held their color deep into the autumn. The air was less heavy with the smoke of politics here. It smelled, instead of tilled earth, of grain drying in the sun, of the damp moss that grew along the shaded banks of narrow rivers. Yet for all the peace it seemed to hold, this was not a place untouched by the reach of the crown. Every harvest owed a portion of itself to the nobility, and every noble owed their allegiance to higher powers, binding even these calm fields to the same web of obligations that tied kingdoms together. Her family's household stood at the edge of a modest town, the kind of place that was just large enough to have a weekly market, a parish church, and a handful of tradespeople whose skills had been passed down for generations. The manor itself was built not for grandeur, but for durability, its walls of pale stone rough to the touch, its roof pitched steep against the rains that came each winter without fail. Within, the floors were uneven in places, worn smooth in others, carrying the imprint of decades of footsteps. The hearth in the great hall was always alight, its fire both a source of warmth and a symbol of hospitality to any who entered. The child was born in the late hours of a cool spring night, when the moon hung low and pale above the still fields. In keeping with the customs of her station, her birth was attended by women of the household, experienced matrons, whose knowledge of such matters came not from books, but from a lifetime of repetition. The midwife, an older woman whose hands were steady even when her voice was quiet, guided the process with a calm born of necessity. Candles burned low in iron holders, their light casting long trembling shadows along the plastered walls. Outside, the world was almost entirely silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional distant bark of a dog. It was customary, in noble families, to give thanks for a safe birth as soon as the mother and child could both be presented to the chapel. Until then, prayers were said in the chamber itself, murmured in Latin by a visiting priest who had been summoned from the church in town. He sprinkled holy water over the infant, a gesture meant to protect her from the unseen dangers believed to linger most strongly in the first days of life. Though she was too small to understand it, this early blessing was the first in a long series of rituals that would shape her existence, tying her life not only to her family, but to the wider spiritual order that underpinned the society into which she had been born. In those first weeks, the pace of life within the manor shifted subtly to accommodate her presence. The rhythms of the household servants, the maids, the kitchen staff, the stable hands, adjusted to the needs of the lady and her newborn. A wet nurse was employed, as was customary for children of noble birth, freeing the mother from the constant demands of feeding. Swaddled in layers of soft linen, the child was carried from chamber to chamber, always accompanied by someone appointed to watch over her. She would have known little of the world beyond the immediate warmth of arms and the muted sounds of activity in the rooms around her, but the structure of her life was already defined by rank, duty, and tradition. The region in which she was born had its own customs, some of which would later seem strange to the courtiers she would one day meet. Local festivals marked the seasons with processions and dances that wound through the narrow streets of the town, bright ribbons tied to poles, garlands of flowers strung above doorways. At harvest, the church bells rang not only for mass, but to call the people together for feasting. These traditions, though simple, carried the weight of centuries, their origins older than the kingdom itself. In her earliest years, she would have seen them not as quaint survivals, but as the natural order of life. It was a childhood, at least in its beginning, that could have promised a kind of stability. Her father's position ensured a measure of comfort and security, while the modest scale of their holdings meant they were spared the constant presence of political intrigue that hovered over larger courts. Yet even here, far from the royal seat, the influence of greater powers could be felt. The banners that hung in the manor's hall bore not only her family's emblem, but the crest of the ruling king, a reminder that their loyalty and their lives were tied to the crown. Her father, a man well versed in the obligations of nobility, managed his lands with a blend of practicality and ceremony. He attended the king's court when summoned, and in quieter times, he corresponded with other noble houses, keeping alive the network of connections that might prove valuable in the future. It was in such correspondence, and in the meetings that occasionally took him far from home, that the first whispers of a future alliance began to take shape. Whispers that spoke of the little girl, still in her cradle, as a potential answer to a problem far beyond the borders of her family's lands. She of course knew nothing of this. Her world was bounded by the walls of the manor, and the safe arms of those who tended to her. She would grow surrounded by the steady routines of a noble household, learning to walk across floors polished by years of care, speaking her first words in the same hall where her father held court over disputes among his tenants. Yet outside those walls, in the wider sphere of noble ambition and royal necessity, her name was beginning to be spoken with interest. It would not be long before that interest would draw the attention of the king himself, setting in motion the slow, deliberate steps that would carry her from this quiet land to the very center of power. And while the seasons turned in her homeland, the fields greening in spring, the harvest heavy in autumn, the snow falling in winter, with a hush that made the world seem briefly still, the plans being formed elsewhere moved at their own pace, following not the rhythm of nature, but the calculated timing of politics. The child would continue to grow here, in the gentle care of her family, for only a handful of years before the first visible sign of those distant plans would reach her home, altering the course of her life forever. In the first years of her life, the manor remained her entire world, a contained universe of stone walls, timber beams, and the steady rhythm of daily tasks carried out by those whose roles had not changed in generations. Mornings began with the sound of servants stirring in the lower halls, stoking the hearth fires, and carrying pails of water from the well. The scent of baking bread would drift slowly upward through the building, mingling with the faint tang of smoke from the kitchen fires. Somewhere outside, hooves struck against the packed earth of the stable yard as grooms led the horses out to be fed. It was a life both predictable and secure, though its order was the product of careful management rather than chance. Her early upbringing followed the patterns expected of a noble daughter, though at first these lessons were woven so gently into her days that they hardly seemed like lessons at all. Before she could read, she learned to listen, to the measured tones of the chaplain as he recited prayers, to the respectful formality with which visitors were greeted, to the quiet authority in her father's voice when he settled matters brought before him. She absorbed without realizing it the unspoken rules of rank, the way to lower her eyes in the presence of certain guests, the moments when silence was preferable to speech. As she grew more steady on her feet, she was allowed to walk the manor's corridors, accompanied by a nursemaid, her small hand resting in the larger calloused palm of a woman who had tended many children before her. These walks were as much about observation as movement. She would pause to watch the steward checking account rolls by the fire, or the weaver working threads into patterned cloth on a loom set near the light of a tall window. Such scenes, though ordinary to the adults around her, formed the background of her understanding, the quiet awareness that a household, like a kingdom, ran on the constant unseen labor of many hands. By the time she could sit attentively for longer stretches, her formal instruction began. A tutor was brought in, a man who had served as clerk to a neighboring noble, and whose thin frame and ink-stained fingers spoke of long hours spent over manuscripts. He taught her first the letters of the Latin alphabet, carefully inked onto wax tablets that could be smoothed and used again. Alongside this, she learned simple prayers, committing them to memory not only for religious observance, but because the rhythm and order of the words were considered proper training for the mind. Her mother, too, took an active role in her education, guiding her through the skills expected of a lady of rank. These began with the simplest forms of needlework, neat stitches along a strip of cloth, and gradually expanded to more elaborate embroidery, the kind used to edge garments or decorate altar cloths for the chapel. At her mother's side, she also learned the management of the household stores, how to measure out grain, how to account for the barrels of ale brewed each season, how to ensure the kitchens were provisioned without waste. Though she could not yet understand the wider implications, these lessons would one day serve her in the much larger and more complex environment of a royal court. In the afternoons, when the weather was fair, she was taken into the manor gardens, a space enclosed by high walls where herbs and medicinal plants grew alongside a few flowering shrubs. The air here was different from the rest of the estate, fragrant with rosemary, mint, and lavender. A servant skilled in such matters showed her how to distinguish between plants used in cooking and those kept for healing, pointing out leaves whose bitter taste meant they were to be handled carefully. These were the practical details of noble life that bridged the domestic and the political, for a well-run household reflected directly on the status of its owners. Her play, too, was shaped by her position. The toys she was given were not random, but chosen with purpose. Small carved animals, dolls clothed in fine scraps, wooden puzzles that required patience to assemble. Such items were meant to train the hands and mind, to cultivate a sense of order and refinement. Yet, even in these small amusements, there was a subtle awareness that her life was part of something larger. Stories told to her by nurses and elder servants were not merely tales for entertainment. They often carried gentle reminders of duty, loyalty, and the importance of honor. Visitors to the manor were occasions for her to practice the forms of greeting she had been taught. She learned to curtsy just deeply enough, to address each person with the correct honorific, to remain still and attentive, while adults spoke over her head about matters she could not yet follow. It was in these moments that the shaping of her role became most visible. She was being prepared, even if only in small ways, for a life in which appearance, bearing and obedience would be as important as any personal feeling. By the time she was old enough to understand more than the immediate moment, she had already developed a natural awareness of the delicate balance between deference and dignity. She knew that her father's authority extended beyond the manor's walls, and that the respect shown to him by tenants and visiting nobles alike was not accidental but the result of generations of carefully maintained alliances. She also understood, without being told directly, that her own behavior was part of this network, that she too represented her family, even if only as a child. Beyond the manor gates, life in the surrounding lands moved at a slower pace. Farmers worked their fields, shepherds tended their flocks on the hills, and the rhythm of the seasons dictated the activity of everyone from the lowest laborer to the local priest. She saw this world only occasionally, when her mother took her to church in town, or when the manor's business required her father to be accompanied by his household. These glimpses, brief though they were, added another layer to her understanding of the hierarchy in which she lived, a structure that placed her above many but bound her, in turn, to the authority of others. The first subtle hints of her future began to appear in the way certain visitors regarded her, a polite interest from traveling clerics, the measured appraisals of other nobles, the occasional questions about her health, her learning and her conduct. These inquiries were often phrased as casual conversation, but they were noted and remembered by her parents. In a world where marriages could be arranged long before either party reached maturity, such interest was rarely without intent. And so, even in these early years, her life was gently directed toward the possibility of a future shaped, not by her own choosing, but by the needs of the family and the alliances that sustained them. She remained, for now, a child in a familiar and sheltered environment, her days filled with lessons, small responsibilities, and the reassuring presence of those she trusted. But beyond the manor's walls, the conversations that would determine her fate were slowly gaining clarity, and before long, the focus of those conversations would turn decisively toward her. While she was still learning her letters at the long table in the manor's upper hall, the man who would one day be called her husband was already years deep into the duties of kingship, his life bound to matters far removed from the rhythm of childhood. He was a man in his late 20s, well past the age when most noblemen of his rank had already married, and yet still without a queen. This absence was not for lack of opportunity. In the years since his coronation, proposals had been carried to his court by the envoys of great houses, each offering daughters or nieces of acceptable lineage. Yet every match had faltered, some on matters of dowry, others on political risk, and a few simply because the alliances they promised were not worth the concessions they demanded. The king's position was complicated by the legacy of his own family's history. His father's reign, though long, had left behind more political fractures than it had repaired. The borders of the realm, though secure for the moment, were surrounded by powers whose loyalty was uncertain, and whose rulers kept a close eye on any sign of weakness within his court. To marry was not merely a personal decision. It was a calculated move in a political game that spanned kingdoms. Each possible bride carried not only her family name, but the weight of the alliances, debts, and rivalries attached to it. He had not been married before. There had been informal arrangements in his youth, the kind of courtly affections that produced whispers among the nobility, but nothing binding in the eyes of the church. As king, however, the matter of marriage could no longer be left to chance. His council pressed him on the issue with increasing frequency, their reminders couched in respectful language, but edged with a quiet urgency. Without a queen, and without the hope of an heir, the stability of his reign was a matter of trust rather than certainty, and trust could erode quickly in a court where ambition was never in short supply. To those who advised him, the question was not whether he should marry, but whom he should marry, and soon. A queen of the right lineage could bring more than companionship. She could bring troops to defend a border, ships to strengthen trade, or lands to expand the crown's influence. She could also serve as a living symbol of unity between his realm and another, the human embodiment of a treaty that would outlast its parchment. In such a context, affection was irrelevant. What mattered was what she represented. The difficulty lay in finding a match that did not invite as many problems as it promised to solve. A bride from a rival kingdom might unite two thrones in the short term, but should tensions rise again, her loyalty would be doubted by both sides. A bride from within his own realm might strengthen internal bonds, but could also inflame jealousies among noble houses passed over for the honor. There was also the question of age, not as a matter of compatibility, but as a matter of timing. A young bride could be molded to the customs of his court, and in the eyes of the council, might offer more years in which to produce heirs. The idea of a much younger bride was not unusual in the context of the age. The church sanctioned such unions when the political advantages were deemed sufficient, and there were precedents of kings marrying girls barely into their adolescence, with the expectation that the union would not be fully consummated until she was older. In the eyes of those who saw the kingdom's survival as paramount, such considerations were entirely practical. In the quieter hours of the evening, when the king sat with his advisors in the private council chamber, the conversation often circled back to the same names. There were princesses and noble daughters in distant lands whose hands had been offered, each attached to promises of mutual benefit. Yet one name began to be repeated with more insistence: the daughter of a noble house in a border region, loyal to the crown, well regarded by the church, and entirely free of the kind of political entanglements that could make a marriage a liability. She was, by all accounts, in good health, of a family known for its careful management of its estates, and perhaps most importantly, very young. The very youth that might have made others hesitate seemed, to the council, an advantage. She could be brought to the royal court at an impressionable age, her upbringing shaped entirely to the customs and expectations of her future role. There would be no competing loyalties, no deeply ingrained habits from another court to unlearn. She could be educated under the direct oversight of the crown, made into precisely the kind of queen the kingdom required. To the councillors who weighed such matters, this was a practical and efficient solution to a pressing problem, and so, while she continued her days in the relative seclusion of her father's manor, the king's mind, and the minds of those who advised him, began to move steadily toward the idea of making her the future queen. It was not yet certain. Such decisions required delicate handling, the quiet exchange of letters, the gauging of interest and terms before any formal proposal could be made. But the first threads of connection had been drawn between them, threads she could not yet see, threads that would in time pull her from the familiar warmth of her home into the cold formality of the royal court. In the months ahead, envoys would travel between the two households, their journeys marked not by haste but by the deliberate pace of medieval diplomacy. Every gesture, every word, every token exchanged would be weighed for its meaning, and when at last the matter seemed settled in principle, there would come the moment when the proposal was carried across the final distance. Not to her, for her consent was neither expected nor required, but to her father, whose answer would carry the weight of both her future and the kingdom's stability. Her father received the first discreet approach on a morning thick with mist, when the fields beyond the manor walls were still grey with the pale light of an early hour, and the servants moved quietly about their duties, as though not to disturb the stillness. The messenger had come not in a flourish of banners, but in the understated dignity of a man who carried a matter of weight in his sealed letters, rather than in his attire. He was an envoy of the royal council, a figure whose presence in the hall was unusual enough to draw the curious glances of retainers and kin alike. Yet when the door to the solar closed behind him, the conversation that began within was heard by no one outside those walls. The negotiations that followed were not the kind in which the girl herself played any part. In truth, she was scarcely mentioned beyond her name, her age and her parentage. The talks were between men whose lives had been spent balancing loyalty with ambition, who measured each other's words not for warmth but for utility. Her father listened as the envoy spoke of the king's regard for his household, of the honor such a union would bestow, and of the benefits that would flow between the two families should the match be agreed. The terms were framed in language that was both formal and careful, each phrase designed to avoid offense while leaving no doubt of the seriousness of the king's intent. It was not a single meeting but a series of them, each separated by days or even weeks, for such matters were never settled in haste. Letters passed between the manor and the royal court, carried by trusted riders who changed horses at known stops and avoided the busiest roads to reduce the risk of interception. These letters were often accompanied by small tokens, a length of fine cloth, a carved ivory box, symbols of goodwill that were as much about maintaining the rhythm of diplomacy as they were about any material value. At times an envoy from the king's household would arrive in person to renew the conversation, their visits marked by subtle ceremony, the offering of wine, the exchange of courtesies, the slow progress of words toward agreement. All the while the girl's life went on as though untouched by the undercurrent shaping her future. She still rose at the same hour, recited her lessons, practiced her embroidery in the long afternoons, and joined her family at the evening meal. If she noticed the unusual frequency of her father's private meetings, or the way her mother's expression sometimes softened into thoughtfulness as she watched her, she gave no sign. The adults did not speak to her of these things, for in their view there was nothing to discuss. A daughter of her birth was not asked whether she wished to marry. She was told when the decision had been made. Behind closed doors the discussions grew more specific. The council required assurances about her dowry, not merely its value but its exact composition. Land holdings were named, revenues calculated, rights of inheritance clarified. In return, her father sought guarantees of her treatment and status at court, the number of attendants she would be allowed, the frequency of her visits home, the precise arrangements for her education once she was under the king's roof. These details were laid out with the precision of a contract, for in many ways that was exactly what the marriage would be, a binding agreement between two powers, sealed in the eyes of the church, and witnessed by the realm. When the matter had advanced far enough that only the formalities remained, the tone of the envoy's visits shifted. They spoke not of possibility but of certainty, as though the match were already decided, and the remaining steps were simply the observance of custom. The question was no longer whether the marriage would take place, but when and under what ceremonial arrangements. There would be a betrothal, blessed by the church, followed, when the king deemed the time suitable, by the wedding itself. In the weeks that followed, her father began to receive letters written in the king's own hand, or at least bearing his personal seal, a mark of direct involvement that carried weight beyond the words themselves. These messages were courteous but firm, expressing anticipation for the alliance and speaking of the honor the bride would bring to the realm. The tone was one of mutual respect between equals, though it was understood by all that the true balance of power lay in the crown's favor, and still she knew nothing of the details, only that there was a change in the air, a quietness in her father's demeanor, a new precision in her mother's attention to her manners and appearance, a sense that her life was being gently steered towards some destination beyond her sight. She could not yet see the shape of it, but the course had already been set, and the slow machinery of royal diplomacy was carrying her toward a future from which there would be no turning back. The morning of the betrothal dawned clear and cold, the air sharp with the faint scent of wood smoke from the hearths that had burned all night to keep the great hall warm. Word of the day's purpose was not shouted from the rooftops, but moved instead in quiet currents, passing from servant to servant, whispered in corners where footsteps would not be overheard. She was dressed in a gown finer than any she had worn before, the fabric smooth beneath her fingers, the colours chosen not for her own taste but for what they would signal to those present. The deep crimson of alliance, the gold of wealth, the white linen underlayer for innocence. Her hair was combed until it shone and bound with ribbons that matched the gown, though she did not yet understand why such care was taken. The ceremony itself was held not in some vast public square, but in the chapel adjoining her family's manor, a place small enough that the smell of beeswax from the candles hung thick in the air, their flames wavering in the stillness. The priest, summoned from the bishop's own circle, spoke words that were older than any living memory, binding not merely two people but two houses in the eyes of God and the law. A small gathering of witnesses, her parents, the royal envoy, 2 members of the king's council, and a handful of carefully chosen kin, stood close enough that their breath misted in the cold. She was too young to recite the vows with any real understanding, yet the priest prompted her gently, and she repeated the words as she had been told, her voice soft and uncertain, a simple ring too large for her small finger, was slid into place only long enough for the gesture to be witnessed before being tucked away for safekeeping until the wedding that lay years ahead. In truth, this was not marriage in the full sense, but in the eyes of both church and crown, it was binding enough that to break it would require more than a change of mind. It would demand dispensation, penance, and a public admission that an oath before God had been set aside. For those present, the weight of the moment lay not in the sight of the child before them, but in the knowledge of what had been accomplished. With this act, the king's claim to her hand was secured against any rival suitor, her dowry pledged to the royal coffers, and the alliance between their houses made visible to the court. Her father's shoulders eased for the first time in months, though his eyes, when they rested on her, carried a shadow of something unspoken. Her mother smiled and adjusted the fall of her veil, but the gesture was more to keep her hands busy than to perfect the arrangement. When the last prayers were said, and the seal pressed into the parchment recording the union, the small party withdrew from the chapel into the muted light of the afternoon. There was no feast that would come with the wedding itself, only a modest table set with bread, cheese and spiced wine for the elders. While the girl was given a cup of watered milk, she sipped it in silence, watching the way the adults spoke in low voices, the way they glanced at her, and then away again, as though the fact of her presence made the weight of their decision heavier. The day ended as quietly as it began, with no music, no laughter, no crowds to cheer, only the slow fading of the winter light through the tall narrow windows, and the knowledge that something irreversible had been done. The ring was locked away, the parchment stored with other precious documents, and the envoy departed with the sealed copy that would be placed in the royal archives. She returned to her chamber, changed back into her plainer dress, and sat by the small fire until the embers dimmed, unaware that her life's course had just been sealed in a way no child could fully grasp, though in the months to come she would begin to understand. The months that followed the quiet betrothal moved with a strange dreamlike rhythm, marked by the slow but deliberate preparations for a journey she did not choose. At first, nothing seemed to change. The same corridors, the same tapestries, the same winter chill seeping under the doors. Yet, she began to notice the way her mother's maid lingered longer over fitting new gowns, the way trunks were brought from the storage rooms and left open to air. The household steward began counting bolts of fabric, tallying silver spoons, and consulting lists written in a careful hand. Servants she had known since birth now lowered their eyes when she spoke, as if unwilling to meet the gaze of someone already slipping away from their world. When spring came, softening the ground and loosening the ice from the riverbanks, the summons arrived from the royal court. It was not written to her, such things rarely were, but to her father, in the formal script of the king's chamberlain, setting the date for her presentation to the king's household. That night, as the candles burned low, she heard her parents speaking behind closed doors, their words muffled, the pauses between them long and heavy. In the morning, nothing was said to her directly, only that she should be ready to leave within a fortnight. The day of departure was clear and cool, the kind of day that would have been perfect for a ride through the countryside, had the circumstances been different. Instead, the courtyard was filled with the clatter of hooves and the creak of leather harnesses as the escort assembled, mounted guards in the king's colours, a small cart for provisions, and the great covered carriage that would carry her most of the way. Before she stepped inside, she turned once toward the manor she had always known, the high roofline against the pale sky, the narrow windows catching the light, the familiar scent of tilled earth and wood smoke carried on the breeze. There was no dramatic farewell, no embrace that lingered too long. Custom did not allow for such open displays. Her mother adjusted the fall of her cloak. Her father nodded once, and then the driver flicked the reins. The road stretched ahead in a long ribbon of packed earth, winding between fields just beginning to green after the long winter. The guards rode in steady formation, their faces impassive, their eyes scanning the horizon out of habit. At each village they passed, curious faces appeared at doorways, children darted out to watch, and murmurs followed in their wake, for though none of them knew her name, they understood the meaning of a guarded carriage bound for the royal city. Nights were spent at the estates of allied nobles, or in the guest chambers of monasteries, where the air was cool with incense, and the silence felt thick enough to press against her skin. Through it all, she was expected to maintain the composure befitting her station. Tears were a private matter, and there was no space for them here, not with the constant presence of the king's men, and the unspoken understanding that her journey was a duty, not a choice. She learned to keep her hands folded neatly in her lap, to speak only when spoken to, and to answer in the careful, measured tone her governess had drilled into her since she was old enough to form sentences. The countryside rolled past in shades of green and brown, but she found herself staring not at the fields or forests but at the horizon, as if searching for something she could not yet name. After many days, the number blurring together in her memory, the air began to change, carrying the scent of the sea from far off, mingled with the faint tang of smoke from the city's hearths. The road widened, the traffic thickened, and the noise grew until it seemed to press in from all sides. The calls of traders, the clatter of cart wheels on stone, the shouts of men unloading barrels at the docks. Above it all rose the distant silhouette of the royal palace, its towers catching the late afternoon sun like the edges of a blade. The carriage slowed, the guards drew closer, and she sat a little straighter, not from pride, but from the instinctive tightening that comes when one is being delivered to a fate sealed long ago. The city swallowed her before she could even take a full breath. The narrow roads that led from the outer gates were choked with people, their voices rising in a dozen dialects she only half understood, the air alive with the smells of tanned leather, roasting meat and fish newly pulled from the sea. The carriage moved slowly now, hemmed in by the press of carts, donkeys, and pedestrians, the guards calling for space with the measured authority of men who knew their place was never questioned. She caught glimpses of market stalls flashing with bright cloth, heaps of spices in earthen bowls, and rows of pottery that gleamed like still water under the sun. Yet all of it passed in fragments, as though she were looking through a series of shifting frames, never allowed to linger long enough to understand what she saw. Gradually, the road began to rise, winding away from the crowded docks and toward the high ground where the palace stood. The houses grew larger here, their facades marked with carved stone lintels and tall windows that shone with leaded glass. The noise of the market dulled into a hum, replaced by the more orderly sounds of the upper wards, the rhythmic clop of hooves on clean cobbles, the soft swish of fine cloaks, and the low murmur of courtiers' conversations carried on the breeze. Above it all, the palace loomed nearer, its pale walls washed in gold by the lowering sun, the banners at its towers hanging almost still in the mild spring air. When the carriage passed under the outer gate, she felt the change in atmosphere as keenly as if she had stepped into another season. Here, the air was quieter, cooler, touched faintly with the scent of beeswax and damp stone. The sound of the portcullis chain rattling into place behind them was a reminder, though she could not yet name it, that once inside these walls there was little chance of leaving without permission. The inner courtyard opened wide before her, lined on three sides with covered arcades, and on the fourth with a broad stairway that climbed to the great doors of the hall. Grooms stepped forward to take the horses. Guards in gilded helms stood unmoving as the party dismounted. The carriage door opened, and for a moment she hesitated, aware of the eyes upon her. A hand, one of the king's chamber servants, extended toward her, gloved and steady. She placed her small fingers into his, the gesture practiced but still unfamiliar, and let herself be guided down. All the flagstones beneath her slippers felt almost too smooth, the space around her too vast after so many days enclosed in the carriage. Inside, the hall was a world apart from the wind-brushed courtyard. The air was warm with the heat of many torches set into iron sconces along the walls, their light glinting on polished shields and painted tapestries that told stories of battles fought generations before her birth. The ceiling soared high above, its beams carved with twisting vines and strange beasts whose eyes seemed to follow her as she passed. Beneath her feet, a long strip of woven carpet marked the path from the great doors to the dais where the king's throne stood. The king himself was not present to greet her. Such honors were rarely bestowed upon a child, and certainly not before the formal introductions had been arranged. Instead, she was met by a cluster of court officials, the master of ceremonies in his crimson robe, the king's steward in dark velvet, a chaplain whose fingers were ink-stained from copying prayers. Their words were courteous but distant, spoken more to her father's representative than to her. Still, they looked her over in a way that felt almost like weighing, taking in the fall of her hair, the quality of her cloak, the steadiness with which she held herself. There was a sequence to be followed, one she had been prepared for in brief, hurried lessons before leaving her homeland. First, she was to curtsy before the steward, then before the chaplain, and finally before the master of ceremonies, each bow a fraction lower than the last. Then came the presentation of the small coffer of gifts her family had sent ahead, a silver mirror framed in ivory, a pair of fine enamel brooches, and a book of devotional verses bound in tooled leather. These were not for the men before her, but for the king's treasury, symbols of goodwill, and the binding of the agreement between their houses. When the formalities were done, the master of ceremonies gestured for her to follow. They passed through a series of side chambers, each more richly appointed than the last, one lined with shelves of illuminated manuscripts, another hung with heavy curtains that muffled every sound. In one, she glimpsed a table laid with crystal goblets and platters of sugared fruits. In another, a tiled hearth where a fire burned low, despite the season filling the room with the faint sweet scent of resin. Everywhere, servants moved silently, their steps measured, their gazes lowered as they performed their tasks. At last, they came to a smaller though still grand chamber where she was to be lodged for the time being. The walls were panelled in oak, darkened by age, the bed hung with curtains of deep green, the window set high enough that it showed only a narrow slice of sky. A maid, one assigned to her service alone, stepped forward to remove her travel cloak and smooth the creases from her gown. Another brought a basin of warm water for her hands. No one asked if she was tired from the journey. Instead, they spoke of the hour for the evening meal, of the need to be presentable when called, of the importance of remembering each title and manner of address. The expectations, she learned quickly, were both invisible and unyielding. She must rise when told, speak only when invited, and move with a grace that concealed any uncertainty. Every person she met in the corridors, from richly dressed ladies to boys carrying messages, had their place, and it was her task to find hers without faltering. The king's court was a place of ceremony as much as it was a seat of power, and even a child could not hope to escape its gaze. That evening, she was summoned to the outer dining hall, not to sit at the king's table, but at a smaller one, set aside for the members of the royal household, who ranked just below the ruling family. The food was richer than anything she had eaten before, roast fowl glazed with honey, bread so soft it yielded at the slightest pressure, small cakes dusted with sugar, but she was careful to eat slowly, to match the pace of those around her, to hold her knife and spoon precisely as her governess had taught. Her conversation was hushed, and though laughter occasionally rippled along the table, it was of the restrained kind that never quite reached the eyes. When she was dismissed for the night, she returned to her chamber in silence, the corridors lit by flickering torches that made the carved figures on the walls seem to shift in the half-light. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the faint murmur of voices from somewhere beyond the walls, until the maid drew the curtains and urged her to sleep. Lying in the unfamiliar bed, she found her thoughts drifting not to the king she had yet to meet, but to the fields outside her family's estate, the sound of the river in spring, the scent of bread baking in her mother's kitchen. And yet, even in the quiet, she understood, though she could not yet have put it into words, that the walls of the palace were more than stone, that they were boundaries as solid as the gates through which she had entered. The court had a rhythm, a language, and an order, and if she was to survive in it, she would have to learn them all before the day came when she was finally brought before the man she was promised to. The wedding, when it finally came, unfolded not as an intimate union between two souls, but as a carefully staged performance, crafted to send an unambiguous message to the realm, and to those who watched from beyond its borders. It was a cold winter morning, though inside the cathedral, heavy tapestries hung from the stone walls, their woven scenes of saints and kings softening the echo of footsteps on the flagstone floor. The air carried the mingled scent of beeswax candles, incense drifting from the swinging censer, and the faint dampness of the ancient building. The girl, barely able to keep her small hands from trembling beneath the folds of her elaborate gown, was led forward by attendants, who had dressed her as they might dress a doll, layer upon layer of silks and brocades in colors chosen not for her taste, but for their heraldic meaning. Every thread was meant to speak of wealth, stability, and divine favor. The king, towering over her, by more than 2 decades of age, and nearly twice her height, stood waiting at the altar, his garments heavy with gold embroidery, the weight of his crown resting with quiet certainty on his head. His eyes, calm and unreadable, scanned the gathered ranks of nobility, clergy, and foreign envoys. To them, this was not a wedding of mismatched ages, but a treaty given physical form, a living symbol that the kingdom's interests would be bound to another noble house for as long as both lived. The priests intoned the ancient Latin phrases that neither bride nor many of the assembled guests truly understood in full, their words binding the child's life to the king's as surely as the ring placed on her small finger. All witnesses stood close, their expressions trained into the serene neutrality expected at such a moment, though in the shadows behind the pillars, murmurs passed among lesser courtiers. Some spoke of the king's shrewdness in securing such a young bride, one who could be molded to his court's customs without the complications of prior loyalties. Others whispered uneasily about the obvious disparity, though such words would never leave the cloistered safety of private rooms. The ceremonial clothing itself told much of the story. Her gown, imported from skilled weavers in distant cities, shimmered with patterns that matched the king's own tunic, a visual declaration that she was now of his household. The embroidery along the hem carried symbols of both her family's coat of arms and the king's, stitched together as though they had always belonged. On her head, a delicate circlet of gold and pearls sat askew, as if it had been meant for someone older, someone whose gaze could meet the king's without having to tilt upward. The liturgy moved on with the inevitability of tradition. Rings were exchanged, his a band of plain gold to show humility before God, hers a smaller version with a single polished stone, more a token of formality than of affection. Their hands were bound together briefly with a strip of embroidered cloth, a ritual act symbolizing their joined fates. Around them, the gathered nobility looked on, their minds already leaping ahead to what this alliance would mean. New trade routes, new allies in times of war, and the possibility, whispered but keenly felt, of a future heir who would carry both bloodlines. Once the vows were spoken, and the blessings given, the organ filled the cathedral with its deep, sonorous notes, a sound that reverberated through the very stone. The couple turned to walk back down the long nave, the king moving with the slow, measured steps of someone long accustomed to the weight of public scrutiny, the child following in his wake, her small shoes clicking faintly against the floor. Outside, the winter light was thin but bright, catching the gilt thread of her gown as she descended the steps. Trumpeters had announced their union to the crowd gathered in the square, though the common people saw only a distant figure in fine clothes beside their monarch. The celebrations that followed were as much about politics as they were about festivity. Banquets were held in the great hall, its long tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, spiced wine, and sugared confections that few outside the nobility could ever taste. Each toast to the bride and groom was really a toast to the stability of the realm, to the hope that this match would strengthen the king's hand in the complex web of feudal loyalties. At her place beside the king, the child sat quietly, hands folded, speaking only when prompted. Her presence was symbolic enough. No one expected her to contribute to the talk of trade agreements and military alliances. As night fell, torches were lit along the castle walls, their flickering light reflected in the frozen moat below. The day's ceremonies had been completed without incident, and for the court, this was victory enough. Yet beneath the carefully maintained order, the reality remained that a child had been placed at the center of a vast political machine, her own will subsumed beneath the needs of a kingdom. The pageantry had masked it well, but as the echoes of the organ faded and the last goblets were drained, the truth was unchanged. And so, with the vows spoken and the feast concluded, the new queen's place was sealed, not yet in the king's private chambers, for the church had its rules about the consummation of such unions, but within the rigid structures of court life. It was here, in these gilded but confining halls, that she would begin the slow transformation from foreign child to figurehead consort, her every step observed, her every gesture weighed for meaning. The wedding had ended, but her new life within the king's household had only just begun, and the eyes of the court would follow her as she took those first hesitant steps into a role she could neither refuse nor escape. In the days that followed the wedding, the palace became less a place of marvel, and more a labyrinth of rituals, corridors, and faces that she could barely keep straight in her mind. The child who had walked beside a king down the cathedral aisle now found herself inhabiting a world in which every waking moment was scheduled, observed, and managed, not by the king himself, but by the machinery of the royal household that seemed to operate as an entity unto itself. Her chambers were situated in a wing of the palace reserved for the queen's apartments, a series of interconnected rooms with tall windows looking out over the inner courtyards, their glass panes so precious that she was told they had been salvaged from earlier reigns. The air here smelled faintly of lavender, a scent kept fresh by small sachets tucked discreetly among the cushions and tapestries, though the cold draughts from the stone walls never quite went away, even with the fires constantly tended in her hearth. She woke not to her own choosing, but to the gentle rustle of her ladies-in-waiting as they entered each morning, their soft voices murmuring greetings before they began the long process of preparing her for the day. These women were chosen carefully, some from her own homeland, to ease the shock of her transition, and others from noble families loyal to the king, to ensure that every moment of her life was quietly reported and guided. They bathed her, combed out her hair with combs carved from ivory, and dressed her in gowns appropriate to her station. Even in the mornings, when she would have preferred simpler clothes, layers of linen, wool and silk were fastened about her, each secured with small jeweled clasps that her own fingers were too small to work. The garments were not simply clothing, they were armor of a kind, meant to display the dignity and wealth of her new position. Meals were served in her own chambers more often than in the great hall, for she was still too young to sit for the long formal banquets without fidgeting, and the court preferred that she be presented only in moments of ceremony. A small table was laid each day with bread still warm from the ovens, dishes of honey, soft cheese, and sometimes slices of fruit preserved in syrup. Servants moved with quiet precision, their eyes never quite meeting hers unless they were spoken to directly. There were rules, unspoken but firmly enforced. She was never to fetch anything for herself, never to pour her own drink, and never to leave her rooms without a lady-in-waiting or an escort. The king, though her husband in name, was a distant presence. His duties kept him in other parts of the palace or out in the city, receiving ambassadors, overseeing councils, and attending to matters of state. Their encounters were brief and formal, a shared meal on feast days, a short exchange in the gardens, the king sometimes inquiring politely after her comfort, though these conversations were more akin to a lord speaking with a favoured ward than to the warmth of a family household. She understood, though perhaps not fully, that her role was not to govern, nor even to share in governance, but to exist as a symbol. In his absence, her time was managed by the Queen's household staff. The palace steward, a tall man with a narrow face and an uncanny ability to appear without warning, oversaw the allocation of food, clothing, and chamber supplies. The mistress of the robes, a stern woman with the bearing of one who had served multiple queens before her, took personal responsibility for ensuring that the young bride's wardrobe reflected the dignity of the realm. Tutors were appointed as well, a cleric to teach her Latin prayers and readings from the Psalter, a court musician to give her lessons in the lute, and a lady of the court skilled in embroidery to guide her in the feminine arts expected of her station. These lessons filled the daylight hours, broken only by short walks in the palace gardens when the weather allowed. The servants, though numerous, were nearly invisible, unless called upon. Pages scurried silently in the corridors, carrying messages or fetching items from the storerooms. Kitchen staff appeared only long enough to set down trays and vanish again. The laundresses, whose work kept her linens crisp and white, she knew only by sight when they passed through the outer halls with baskets balanced on their hips. Her ladies-in-waiting remained the only constant human presence, always nearby, always attentive, and always subtly guiding her behavior. They corrected her posture at table, reminded her to address certain people with particular titles, and gently drew her away from windows or doors if she lingered too long without cause. There was a certain safety in this structure, though it was a safety that came at the price of freedom. She was never without company, yet she was often lonely, for none of those who surrounded her were friends in the way she understood the word. They were protectors, mentors and overseers, but they were also eyes and ears for the court, and every word she spoke might be carried, however innocently, to the king or his advisors. When she wished to be alone, she found her only refuge in small acts, turning the pages of an illuminated book for longer than necessary, gazing into the fire until the logs crumbled into embers, or letting her hand rest for a moment on the cool stone of the window ledge, while the garden lay quiet below. Her absence from adult duties was both a mercy and a quiet reminder of her youth. While the king met with his council in the great chamber, she was seated in her embroidery room, the distant murmur of political discussion reaching her only as a faint hum through the walls. Or when visiting nobles arrived, she was sometimes summoned to greet them, dressed in her finest attire, smiling on cue, and withdrawing before any discussion of alliances or disputes could begin. She was expected to be seen, admired, and then forgotten until the next occasion called for her presence. This was the invisible labor of queenship at her age, not in issuing decrees or hosting councils, but in existing as an emblem of stability and propriety. At night, the palace grew quiet, except for the occasional distant echo of footsteps from the watchmen making their rounds. She slept in a bed carved from oak and draped in heavy curtains to keep out the cold, a small lamp burning beside her through the long winter nights. Sometimes she would listen to the faint, rhythmic sound of the guards' boots on the courtyard stones and wonder how many years would pass before she would be called upon to take a more active role. For now, her life was one of waiting for the seasons to turn, for her lessons to accumulate, for the day when her role as the king's consort would become more than ceremonial. In the meantime, the palace itself seemed to watch her as much as its people did. The high ceilings, the carved beams, the painted saints looking down from the chapel walls, all of it a reminder that she was part of something far older, larger, and more permanent than her own small person. Her name might someday be etched in the chronicles beside the king's, but for now, she was simply a child within the great, unyielding order of the royal household, her days passing like beads on a string, each one much like the last, each bound by the quiet certainty that nothing within these walls happened by chance. The seasons turned with the patient inevitability of the medieval calendar, and while the child bride moved quietly through the polished corridors of the palace, her husband's gaze was fixed far beyond the confines of the royal household. He was a man who had been shaped by decades of rule, by the tense negotiations of court politics, and by the restless demands of kingdoms that were never fully at peace. To govern in such an age was to carry the weight of a realm not as an abstract notion, but as a living, breathing thing, one that could falter if neglected for even a moment. His council chambers were heavy with the scent of wax and parchment, and here, day after day, decisions were made that reached into the smallest villages and the most distant fortresses. The king's governance was neither light-handed nor without purpose. Every tax collected, every judgment rendered, every appointment made was part of an intricate web of power designed to keep the realm intact. The nobles who served under him were bound by oaths of loyalty, but oaths were fragile in a time when ambition could burn hotter than fealty. There were factions within the court who watched him with calculating eyes, waiting for moments of weakness that could be exploited, and he knew that the wrong marriage, the wrong alliance, or even the wrong delay in policy could set into motion a chain of events that would shake the throne. It was this constant awareness of danger from without and intrigue from within that drove him to act with both caution and decisiveness. Yet beyond the castle walls, the kingdom was a patchwork of peace and unrest. Some regions flourished under his rule, with markets that hummed with activity and harvests that promised stability. In others, discontent stirred quietly among the peasants, fueled by the burdens of war levies and the heavy hand of tax collectors. borders were never still in this period of history. There was always a neighboring ruler testing the edges, probing for signs of weakness, whether through armed raids or through calculated diplomacy meant to unsettle alliances. The king was no stranger to such tactics. He had fought in his youth, leading campaigns to secure trade routes and fortify strategic strongholds, and though the years had made him more deliberate, they had not dulled his willingness to send men to the field when necessary. War, in his time, was not an exceptional occurrence, but a recurring condition of kingship. Messengers came and went with tidings of skirmishes in distant provinces, reports of sieges laid against fortresses, and requests for reinforcements to hold a river crossing or mountain pass. The rhythms of the palace itself reflected the shifting tides of conflict, at one moment filled with the clatter of armor being prepared for the road, at another, hushed with the tension of awaiting news from the front. The child bride, still too young to grasp the full meaning of these movements, would see the great hall transformed by the presence of armored captains and foreign envoys, their voices low but urgent as they stood over maps spread across long tables. While the king was away on campaign, governance did not halt. His council of advisers, trained to follow his will, kept the machinery of rule in motion, though always under the shadow of his eventual return. War demanded resources, and resources demanded the cooperation of those who might not always see the benefit of the king's ventures. Negotiations for supply lines were as critical as battlefield maneuvers, and the treasury felt the strain of outfitting armies, paying mercenaries, and rebuilding what conflict had torn apart. In such times the peasants' burden increased, and murmurs of discontent reached the court in the form of petitions or, on occasion, in the more dangerous guise of rebellion. The king's skill lay not only in military strategy, but in his ability to weave together disparate threads into a coherent pattern of authority. Victories were followed by carefully staged displays of generosity, pardons granted, grain distributed, and feasts held in honor of loyal vassals, all meant to reinforce the image of a ruler whose strength was matched by benevolence. Defeats, when they occurred, were met with a different kind of theatre, renewed vows of vengeance, public punishments for perceived traitors, and swift movements to shore up defenses. In both victory and loss, the performance of kingship was as important as the practical outcomes. For the child queen, these years were a blur of absence and presence. Sometimes the king would return, his face lined from long days in the saddle, his voice carrying the weight of command even in private chambers. At other times, she would hear of him only in the form of reports. Victories won, treaties signed, territories reclaimed. She lived within the architecture of his reign, but rarely touched its foundations, her world still confined to the gardens, the chapel, and the quiet rooms where she was taught to read the prayers and histories that would one day form part of her queenly duties. And yet, even in her secluded spaces, the echoes of his governance reached her. The changing number of guards at the gates, the arrival of new banners to hang in the great hall, the sudden presence of unfamiliar faces among the courtiers, all were signs of the shifting balance of power in the kingdom. War brought strangers to the court, some as honored guests, others as captives or hostages, meant to ensure the compliance of their kin. She learned without being told directly that her position as queen was not a matter of personal affection but a fixed piece on the board of power, placed there to hold alliances as firmly as the king's armies held the borders. These were not gentle years for the realm. The drumbeat of conflict was steady, and while some seasons brought relative calm, none were free from the undercurrent of tension that defined medieval rule. To govern was to guard, and to guard was to be forever alert, a truth the king understood instinctively and lived by. His marriage to the young queen had not changed this reality. It had only given him another political thread to weave into the fabric of his rule. The court, for all its ceremonies and luxuries, was merely another fortress, and every alliance, no matter how personal it appeared, was another wall in the defense of the realm. In time, the long campaigns, the shifting alliances, and the constant demands of rule would create a stage on which the young queen's role could no longer remain entirely symbolic. For now, however, she remained a figure in the background, her presence felt but not yet fully called upon. The king's governance and his wars would shape the world she inhabited, and the victories and losses that followed would draw her closer, step by slow step, into the center of that world. It was in this gradual movement, from the quiet of her chambers toward the shadow of the throne, that the next stage of her life would begin, marked not by her own choice, but by the relentless turn of the political wheel. The girl, though already bound by the title that court ceremony had draped upon her, was still very much a child, and the palace recognized this, though in its own rigid way. Within the high walls of the queen's chambers, a set of interconnected rooms heavy with woven hangings, thick carpets, and the faint scent of beeswax polish, her days began to take on a deliberate rhythm. The apartments were quieter than the echoing halls of the great audience chamber, but no less formal in their own way. Here life was measured not by the clang of swords or the shouts of heralds, but by the slow cadence of instruction, each hour allotted to some facet of her transformation from foreign-born girl into the consort expected by the kingdom. Her first lessons were in the language of her new home, not only the words themselves, but the way they were to be spoken. Every syllable was to be rounded, softened, shaped by the rules of courtly speech, so that nothing coarse might pass her lips. A pair of aging noblewomen, appointed as her guardians in education, would sit beside her with heavy books bound in calfskin, guiding her through lines of scripture, poetry, and official decrees. These women had little warmth to offer, but they carried the authority of long years in royal service, and they understood, with a kind of cold efficiency, the necessity of molding her into something acceptable for the role she would one day fully inhabit. Other hours were devoted to the rituals of etiquette. Here the world narrowed to the smallest of movements, the incline of the head when greeting a noble, the exact placement of the fingers on the edge of a goblet, the way to sit at table without letting the feet or the folds of a gown betray restlessness. There were rules for how far she should stand from the king when in public, how to receive envoys, and how to walk beside another queen should she be required to host visiting royalty. She learned how to conceal emotion behind a calm, unreadable expression, for any flicker of the eyes or curve of the lips could be interpreted by the court's watchful eyes as a political signal. Religion was woven into all of it. Each morning began with the soft chanting of prayers, her small voice joining the measured tones of the chaplain, who oversaw her instruction in matters of faith. She memorized passages from sacred texts, not only for her own salvation, but because a queen was expected to be the moral mirror of her kingdom. The chaplain would tell her, in the same slow tone he used to recite the Psalms, that the people looked to their rulers as a reflection of divine order, and so her every action, even the quiet ones within the walls of the palace, must be conducted as if watched by the heavens. As she grew older, the content of her instruction began to stretch beyond personal comportment. The women of her household would set out parchments with careful maps, tracing the jagged edges of the kingdom's borders and pointing to the neighboring realms whose allegiances might shift with the wind. She was told the names of dukes, counts, and bishops, and instructed on the subtle, almost invisible hierarchies that governed their interactions. Her lessons in diplomacy were abstract at first, spoken in gentle tones and couched in examples from the past, but there was a clear aim beneath them. One day, she would have to navigate these networks herself, and a misstep could ripple outward far beyond the palace walls. Even her play was shaped into preparation. The dolls and carved animals of her earliest years were gradually replaced with embroidered cushions that she was expected to stitch herself, the patterns reflecting heraldic designs and religious symbols. When she painted or drew, it was with the intention of producing small gifts suitable for visiting dignitaries, her work to be seen as a reflection of the refinement of the court. The songs she learned were not the simple, lilting ones of childhood, but long, layered ballads recounting the deeds of saints, kings, and queens. Histories that, once absorbed, would become part of the narrative she was expected to embody. The queen's chambers became a kind of enclosed world, one where seasons changed outside the windows, but inside remained constant in its ordered progression. She began to notice how the older women carried themselves, never rushing, never allowing the fabric of their gowns to sway too freely, never speaking without first measuring the weight of their words. This unhurried, deliberate manner settled into her own movements, so that over time the quick, unthinking gestures of childhood were smoothed away, replaced by a stillness that the court would take as a sign of composure. Yet, There was an odd emptiness to it all. Though she was surrounded daily by people, attendants, tutors, ladies in waiting, there was a certain distance that none seemed willing to cross. Their role was to shape her, not to befriend her, and so the moments of kindness were subtle and fleeting, a servant smoothing a wrinkle in her gown without being asked, a tutor pausing an extra second before correcting a mistake. Most of the time, her world was one of watchfulness, where every lesson was a reminder that she was less a person than a figure in an arrangement far older and larger than herself. By the time she reached her 12th year, the structure of her education had expanded again. She began to sit quietly in the background of certain audiences with visiting nobles, her presence intended less for her own benefit than for theirs, a reminder that the line of succession, however young and untried, was in place. She absorbed the patterns of such meetings without fully realizing it. The exchange of formal greetings, the careful way each side circled around the matters at hand before settling on an agreement, the way nothing was ever said in a way that could not later be denied or reinterpreted. And so the seasons turned, and with each passing year, the child became more of the queen she was expected to be, her identity built layer by layer in the still, echoing rooms of the palace. What she could not yet know was that all this preparation, the language, the etiquette, the religion, the diplomacy, would soon be tested beyond the safety of the queen's chambers, as the king's health and the kingdom's stability began to shift in ways that would draw her more directly into the visible life of the realm. The years that followed the unusual marriage were marked by a careful and uneasy balance within the walls of the royal palace. A balance that was never truly steady but rather shifted with the changing seasons, the ebb and flow of military fortunes, and the subtle currents of noble ambition. The court, always a place of ceremony and performance, became a stage upon which the very fact of the marriage was both defended and quietly challenged, depending on who spoke to whom, and in what company. On the surface, life proceeded with the expected rhythms of a medieval monarchy. Councils met, petitions were heard, proclamations were issued, but beneath the polished veneer of protocol there existed an ongoing murmuring, a quiet undercurrent of discomfort among certain members of the nobility and foreign dignitaries alike. The union of a grown king and a child bride, though legal within the frameworks of the time, was not without its critics, and the whispers they spread wove themselves into the daily fabric of court life. Much of the tension sprang from the natural divisions that formed between factions within the realm, those who had supported the marriage as a calculated alliance, and those who had seen it as an overreach, an act of desperation, or even an embarrassment on the international stage. The king's closest advisors maintained, at least in public, that the union had secured much-needed stability, binding together two territories in a bond of dynastic blood. Yet, not all accepted this interpretation. Among the higher nobility, there were lords whose daughters had been passed over for the royal match, their political ambitions dashed by the decision to import a foreign child from a distant noble house. Their resentment, though not openly declared, could be read in the formality of their words, in the stiffness of their bows, and in the deliberate slowness with which they offered fealty at official gatherings. The Queen's youth was itself a point of constant, though carefully coded, discussion. Courtiers spoke of her as unready or unripened, and while such language was presented as a statement of fact rather than insult, the repetition of it reinforced her position as one who was present but not yet truly a queen. She had not yet borne heirs, and though the marriage contract assured her place in the succession plan, there were those who feared the potential instability that might come from the king's advancing age and the absence of a direct heir. Such fears were fertile ground for intrigue. Lesser nobles, eager to rise, positioned themselves as indispensable intermediaries between the king's faction and the sceptics, quietly gathering influence while maintaining a facade of loyalty to both sides. Foreign envoys, sent to maintain diplomatic ties, recorded their impressions in letters home. In the archives of certain courts, there remain hints of their words, veiled observations about the strangeness of a kingdom whose queen was still in the schoolroom, learning to read courtly Latin, while seated beside governesses instead of presiding over feasts. They noted that the marriage, while technically permissible by canon law, risked being interpreted as a sign of vulnerability. A monarch willing to wed so young a bride must, in their view, be prioritizing an alliance above all else, even dignity. Some of these envoys took care to report such matters discreetly. Others, less restrained, allowed the gossip to reach ears in rival courts, where it was repeated with just enough embellishment to make it sting. Inside the palace, the young queen's household, though modest compared to that of a fully grown consort, became a small center of its own influence. Her ladies-in-waiting, chosen by the king and his council from families both loyal and ambitious, were aware that proximity to her might one day yield great rewards, yet their loyalty was divided. While some were protective of the girl's innocence and shielded her from courtly barbs, others found ways to carry information from her chambers to other parts of the court, passing along harmless details at first, then later more sensitive observations. The fact that she was too young to understand the weight of certain questions made her vulnerable to being used as a source of intelligence. The king, preoccupied with governance and the demands of intermittent warfare, did little to address the quieter unrest in his court. His absences on campaign or in extended council sessions created opportunities for whispers to grow into subtle plots. No rebellion emerged from these tensions. The monarchy remained secure, but there was a noticeable shift in how certain nobles conducted themselves. Formal dinners became arenas for symbolic displays of loyalty or dissent. The seating arrangements at such gatherings, carefully dictated by tradition, were scrutinized for signs of favor or slight. A single place moved further from the high table could be read as punishment, while an unexpected invitation to sit closer might signal the beginning of reconciliation. As the years passed, the young queen grew taller, her features sharpening from the roundness of childhood into something more recognizably adult, though she was still not of an age to fulfill the deeper expectations of her role. With her growth came changes in how she was regarded. Some courtiers softened their criticisms, seeing in her the makings of a future monarch. Others only sharpened their concerns, noting that the longer it took for her to bear an heir, the more fragile the succession would become. These observations, never voiced openly in her presence, nonetheless formed part of the atmosphere she inhabited, a climate of constant assessment, where her very existence was measured not in personal worth but in political utility. There was also the matter of the clergy. Bishops and church advisors, always present in matters of marriage and legitimacy, were divided in their opinions. While they affirmed the sanctity of the union and its adherence to the letter of canon law, there were murmurs among the lower clergy and monastic scholars about whether such a disparity in age was spiritually sound. Theological debates on the subject remained confined to cloisters and private studies, but they nonetheless contributed to a broader sense that the marriage was not beyond reproach. All of these elements, the resentful nobles, the cautious allies, the foreign observers, the divided clergy, formed a complex tapestry of courtly tension, one that the young queen could neither fully see nor yet influence. She moved through her days in the palace much as before, attending lessons, observing ceremonies, and learning the rituals of hospitality, all the while unaware of how many eyes watched her progress, weighing her every step against the kingdom's needs. In this atmosphere of restrained rivalry and unspoken judgments, the court continued to function, yet it was a place where each act and omission carried meaning, where even silence could be political, and it was within this charged environment, this network of alliances and quiet dissent, that the next phase of her life would unfold, a phase in which her own presence would become not merely symbolic but central to the shifting fortunes of the realm. As her lessons in the Queen's chambers gave way to the more delicate arts of survival, in a court that was never entirely united in its welcome of her, the slow passage of years within the thick, echoing walls of the royal residence had an almost imperceptible way of altering the place, and those who lived in it, as though the very stones kept count in their own patient manner, recording each change in mood and season without judgment. For the young queen, whose earliest memories of the palace were filled with the faint sense of being a guest in someone else's world, time gradually brought a shift in both her place and her perception. What had once felt vast, intimidating, and heavy with a sense of unspoken expectation, began to seem almost navigable, not because the structure itself had grown smaller, but because she had, step by step, learned the unspoken rhythms that dictated life within it. By the time she reached the age at which the court would begin to regard her as more than a symbolic figure in silk and jewels, Her daily routines had already been shaped by a decade of observation and adaptation. The earliest years had been defined by lessons carried out in private rooms, where the scent of beeswax polish and the distant murmur of servants moving through the corridors formed the quiet backdrop to her education. Now those years had hardened into a kind of practiced composure, the calm exterior of one who understood that every movement was noticed, every glance interpreted, and every silence read for meaning. The court did not mark her coming of age with a single sudden announcement. Instead, it unfolded as a gradual loosening of restrictions, a shift that others noticed before she did. Invitations began to arrive, not merely for her to attend banquets and festivals as a silent observer beside the king, but to preside over certain ceremonies in his absence. Small though they were at first, the christening of a noble child, the blessing of a new guild charter, the welcoming of foreign messengers, they carried weight in a world where appearances were currency. Her youth, which had once been seen as a limitation, began to be reframed by the king's advisors as a quality that could be molded to the benefit of the realm. Her ceremonial attire changed as well. The gowns that once overwhelmed her with their sheer volume were replaced by garments tailored to her more mature form, each one chosen to emphasize dignity rather than innocence. The elaborate braiding of her hair, the layering of fabrics, the arrangement of jewels at her collar, all of it was intended to speak the language of authority, even if the words themselves were still chosen by others. As she moved through the great hall on state occasions, courtiers began to bow not simply in deference to her title, but with an acknowledgement that she was no longer the child who had first been presented to them. Yet beneath the surface of ceremony, her position remained tethered to the reality of her marriage, a union that had been arranged when she had been too young to grasp its implications. The king, still vigorous in his governance and deliberate in his manner, treated her more as a representative of an alliance than as an active partner in statecraft. When they appeared together, it was to project stability, to assure both allies and rivals that the royal household stood united. Privately, their interactions were measured and courteous, but the distance between their experiences of the world remained as wide as the years that separated them. Her duties extended beyond mere appearances. The women who served her, a carefully selected circle of ladies-in-waiting, most from families with political ties to the crown, became both companions and advisors, introducing her to the subtler aspects of influence within the palace. They taught her the weight of a gesture, the value of withholding an opinion until the moment was most advantageous, and the way to navigate the quiet rivalries that shaped the loyalties of servants and courtiers alike. These were lessons learned not from books, but from observation and careful repetition, until they became as instinctive as breathing. The process of becoming visible in the eyes of the court was not without its challenges. The same nobles who had once dismissed her as a child now examined her with a sharper, more critical gaze, looking for signs of overreach or weakness. Every rumor, no matter how small, could be cultivated into a whisper campaign if it served the aims of a rival faction. She learned quickly that her position was as precarious as it was prominent, and that the favor of the king could not shield her entirely from the subtle undercurrents of ambition and resentment that ran through the palace. Beyond the walls, the realm itself continued to shift. The king's military campaigns and political maneuvers brought new territories into the fold and strengthened certain alliances, but they also created fresh tensions, both within the nobility and among the common people. When she rode in the royal processions, she could feel the eyes of the gathered crowds upon her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, loyalty, and in some cases open indifference. She had learned not to expect adoration, but she understood that her image was an instrument, one that could be polished or tarnished depending on how it was used. As the seasons turned, her place in the court's hierarchy solidified. She began to host small gatherings in her private chambers, occasions where the barriers of rank softened just enough to allow frank conversation. Here she could speak with the wives of influential men, with visiting noble women, and with those whose positions at court were not high enough to warrant direct counsel with the king, but who nonetheless shaped opinion in quiet ways. These gatherings, though ostensibly social, became a means of gathering information and gauging sentiment, offering her a degree of agency that would have been unthinkable in her earlier years. The shift from child to ceremonial figure, to recognized consort, was not marked by any single triumph, but by the accumulation of countless small adjustments, each bow returned with measured grace, each public appearance carried out without misstep, each private conversation carefully weighed before words were spoken. The palace had a way of testing its inhabitants without ever declaring the nature of the examination, and she had learned to navigate its endless corridors, both physical and political, without losing her footing. Still, the weight of her role was never entirely absent. In the stillness of her private quarters, when the corridors outside had gone quiet, and the light from the last candle flickered against the stone, she was aware of the narrowness of her life's path, a course set in motion long before she had been old enough to walk it. Yet she also recognized that within those limits, there were spaces in which she could act, however subtly, to shape the court's perception of her, and in time perhaps its reality. It was in this careful balance between duty and quiet assertion that her position as queen began to take on a more defined form. The days of being merely an ornament to the throne were fading, replaced by a role that demanded constant attention, composure, and the ability to read the unspoken language of power. The years ahead would test these skills in ways she could not yet foresee, for the currents within the palace were shifting once more, and with them would come a series of trials that would draw her more deeply into the heart of courtly life than she had yet ventured. By the time the young queen had grown beyond the years of childhood, and entered the carefully measured sphere of ceremonial adulthood, the marriage that had once been dismissed in hushed tones as an arrangement too stark in its imbalance of age, had transformed, in the eyes of the court, into a practical and deeply useful political instrument. In the first seasons of her maturity, she began to appear beside the king in the grand audience hall, no longer merely as an ornament whose presence was dictated by tradition, but as a deliberate symbol woven into the tapestry of the realm's diplomacy. Her movements were rehearsed, her expressions studied, and every gown she wore was chosen to carry a message, sometimes to affirm the realm's unity, sometimes to hint at a new accord being considered, and sometimes to serve as a silent reminder to foreign emissaries that alliances here were sealed in bonds far deeper than parchment and seal. The king, now entering the later stretch of his middle years, had learned to use her presence as an extension of his political persona. In receiving foreign delegations, he would allow her to sit slightly elevated beside him, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes cast neither too high nor too low, in the exact posture that the court tutors had drilled into her for years. To those visiting from distant courts, she was not merely a wife, but a visible link to the network of noble families across the continent. Her own lineage, traced through generations of lords and ladies in the land of her birth, was a constant point of reference in the whispers of envoys, who read into her every public appearance a message about which territories the king considered his allies, and which he viewed as potential rivals. It was during these years that she began to understand, not in the way of personal conviction, but through the slow repetition of carefully managed events, that her role was not defined by her own desires, but by the function she served in a larger political design. Treaties that had stalled for months would suddenly advance after a banquet, in which she sat at the right hand of a visiting ruler, her youthful composure lending an air of continuity and stability to the king's court. A marriage that had begun as a transaction between two distant households had now become a tool of statecraft, the human embodiment of an alliance that, for as long as it held, would keep certain borders calm and certain armies idle. The pace of this transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible to those who saw her daily. It emerged in the way visiting nobles began to address her directly when discussing matters of trade or territory, knowing that her words, though sparse, would be carried back to the king with care. It emerged in the increasingly deliberate placement of her at feasts, sometimes beside ambassadors from regions that the king sought to draw into his influence, sometimes across from emissaries whose loyalty was wavering. Her mere presence intended to soften resistance, even in religious ceremonies. She became part of the king's silent arguments, kneeling at his side during solemn blessings. She was meant to project the image of divine approval upon the kingdom's alliances. Beyond the walls of the palace, her image began to spread in less tangible ways. Minstrels sang of the queen whose foreign birth had brought peace between two lands, and tapestries commissioned by the king's own weavers began to depict her standing beside him beneath banners of unity. The accuracy of such depictions mattered little. It was the idea that mattered, the suggestion that her marriage had secured not only a crown for her head but stability for the realm. The people, whose lives were more immediately shaped by the price of grain and the threat of raiders than by the subtleties of dynastic strategy, accepted these images as a sign that their ruler was strong enough to command loyalty at home and abroad. Yet behind this deliberate construction of image and influence, her daily existence remained one of measured appearances and carefully limited freedoms. She did not negotiate the treaties herself, nor did she speak in council sessions where the final terms were set. Instead, she moved through the spaces between official acts, embodying the unity that the king's ministers wished to display. Her role in hosting banquets for visiting rulers was not merely to ensure that the guests were fed and entertained, but to give the impression, through her gracious composure, that the king's household was in perfect order, a reflection of the kingdom's stability. It was during these occasions that she learned how silence could serve as a political act. By withholding her voice except in moments chosen for her, she became a canvas onto which others projected their hopes, ambitions, and assumptions. An ambassador might leave believing her to be a quiet supporter of his cause. Another might believe her cool reserve signaled disapproval. The truth was that her expressions, her pauses, her faint inclinations of the head were not spontaneous at all, but rehearsed gestures, refined through years of instruction in the Queen's chambers, now deployed to serve the shifting needs of state. As the years moved forward, she found herself increasingly linked to the king's efforts to manage the realm's borders through diplomacy rather than arms. Her appearance at a hunting feast with the envoys of a neighboring duchy could be taken as a signal that a trade agreement was near. Her absence from a festival attended by certain envoys could be interpreted as a warning. The court chroniclers, whose records would later shape the memory of this period, began to note her role in these events with deliberate care, as though to underline that the queen, once a child bride brought across distant lands, was now a figure woven into the realm's political fabric. In time, this carefully cultivated image would bring her into closer contact with matters of governance, though not in the way of direct command. Rather, her presence at the edges of decision-making meant she could see more clearly than before the way rival factions maneuvered for influence and how fragile the peace truly was beneath the surface. These observations, gathered quietly as she performed her role in the public eye, would shape the next stage of her life at court, one where the subtle art of appearing as a passive symbol would begin to give way to more deliberate acts of influence. And so, as one season of political ceremonies closed and another began, her position as a silent partner in the king's statecraft deepened, drawing her further into the undercurrents of power that flowed unseen through the palace halls, leading to moments when her carefully guarded image would be tested in ways that neither she nor those who had arranged her marriage could have foreseen. By the time the girl, once a quiet and watchful child, had grown into the full stature of her young adulthood, the man she had been bound to since her earliest memories was no longer the vigorous figure of authority that had once dominated every chamber of the palace, which comes slowly and then all at once, had begun to press heavily upon him, its signs showing not only in the silvering of his beard and the slackening of his once commanding posture, but in the irregular patterns of his appearances in court, and the increasingly prolonged absences from public ceremonies. His health had been faltering for years, the kind of steady decline that those closest to him noticed well before it became the subject of murmured comment among the wider nobility. Yet now the pace of that decline had quickened. Once he had ridden into battle with a banner raised and the kind of stern certainty that could quell dissent before it formed. Now, the simple act of mounting a horse left him pale and breathless. The ailments that afflicted him were many, and often kept hidden behind the guarded words of his physicians. In the guarded privacy of the royal chambers, his attendants noted the persistent cough that came in the damp mornings, the stiffness in his joints that turned every movement into something deliberate and slow, and the bouts of fever that left him irritable and confused. Physicians from across the realm, and on occasion from beyond its borders, were brought to his side, their treatments ranging from the application of scented poultices to the prescribing of rare herbs ground into bitter draughts. Each remedy was spoken of as though it might restore him, yet none truly could turn back the relentless passage of time. As his health waned, so too did the centrality of his presence in the machinery of governance. The council, which had always deferred to his judgment, now met more frequently without his direct involvement, with decisions presented to him already shaped and sealed. At first, this arrangement was said to be a temporary measure, a way to spare him the burden of everyday affairs while he recovered. But as months passed, it became clear that this was not a passing infirmity. Certain ministers, those who had long been ambitious for greater influence, began to assert themselves more openly, while others sought the protection of old alliances to maintain their footing in the shifting balance of power. The young queen, still bound by the conventions of her station, found herself neither fully in control nor entirely excluded. She was expected to remain a figure of grace and composure, receiving guests and presiding over ceremonial occasions, yet now there were moments when she was also called upon to carry messages from the council to the king, or to sit at his bedside when delicate matters required his faint but necessary assent. In those dimly lit chambers, where the heavy curtains were often drawn to shield the weakening king from the glare of the midday sun, she would listen as decisions were explained to him in slow, careful tones, his responses coming in murmurs that seemed to carry less the weight of command than the weariness of one who knew his time for shaping the realm was drawing to a close. Outside those private walls, the court itself had begun to feel the strain of uncertainty. Rumors, which thrived in the spaces where truth was scarce, spread quickly among the servants and lesser officials, whispers of who might rise to prominence should the king's reign end, of which alliances would be preserved, and which would fracture under new leadership. Some spoke of foreign courts already making discreet inquiries, testing the resolve of the realm's envoys for signs of weakness. Even the clergy, usually unshakable in their public pronouncements, began to offer prayers for the king's health with a solemnity that carried the unspoken acknowledgement that they might soon be offering prayers for his soul instead. The physical changes in the king mirrored the changes in the atmosphere of the palace. Where once there had been the clamour of preparations for hunting parties and the sharp, purposeful rhythm of daily audiences, there was now a slower, almost suspended quality to life within the stone walls. The great hall, where he had once presided with steady authority, was used less often, its high windows gathering dust and its tapestries seeming to fade in the absence of their intended audience. Even the sound of the royal musicians, once a constant accompaniment to evening meals, grew infrequent, their melodies replaced by the hushed footsteps of attendants moving along dim corridors. For the queen, still young yet marked by the years she had spent adapting to her role, this period was both a test and a quiet reshaping of her position. The distance between her and the man she had been wed to at the age of 6, a distance born of their vast difference in years and the formal constraints of courtly life, now seemed more pronounced in his absence from daily governance. Yet she was not untouched by his frailty. There was a recognition, unspoken but present, that his decline would inevitably alter the course of her own life. She moved through the palace with the measured grace expected of her, but with an awareness that the patterns she had lived by since her arrival were beginning to loosen. Diplomatic visits, which had once been occasions for the king to assert his dominance, now often saw the queen receiving guests in his stead. Though she could not speak with the final authority of the crown, her presence served as both a reassurance and a reminder. Reassurance that the court remained intact, and a reminder to allies and rivals alike that the royal household was not yet without leadership. These appearances were carefully managed, each word and gesture observed and weighed, for in such times even the smallest sign of uncertainty could be interpreted as weakness. The seasons passed, and with each winter the king's health seemed to retreat further. The warmth of spring no longer revived him as it once had, instead it left him fatigued, his days often confined to the quieter shaded rooms of the inner palace. Couriers still brought news from distant territories, but where once he had pored over such reports with a strategist's mind, he now often left them unread for days, content to let others decide what must be done. This withdrawal was not without its consequences. Borders became less secure, trade agreements less vigorously enforced, and the once carefully maintained network of loyalty among the nobility began to show signs of strain. The queen, for her part, began to occupy an increasingly central place in the rituals of the court, not by sudden ambition but by the slow accumulation of necessity. She learned to navigate the spaces between tradition and opportunity, representing the crown in settings where her youth had once excluded her, and finding that the expectations placed upon her now carried the weight of preparation for what might soon come. In this way, her life continued to intertwine with the declining shadow of the man who had been both her monarch and her husband, the two of them bound together less by the living strength of a reign than by the slow, inevitable passage toward its end. And as the chill of another autumn settled over the capital, the question of succession, whispered at first in the margins of political conversation, began to take shape in the forefront of courtly thought, drawing her ever more deeply into the web of calculations and cautious maneuvers that would decide not only the fate of the realm, but her own place within it. By the time the king's strength had begun to ebb in earnest, the transformation within the palace was almost imperceptible to those who did not pay close attention, yet for those who lived within its walls every day, it was impossible to ignore. The once commanding figure of the sovereign, who had spent decades issuing decrees, presiding over councils and riding out with armies, now appeared less frequently in the grand audience hall, and when he did, his steps were measured, his speech slower, his once vigorous gestures reduced to the bare minimum required for ceremony. In his place, decisions that could not wait for his convenience began to be taken by others, and in that gradual redistribution of responsibility, the queen found herself no longer merely the symbolic partner of the crown, but an active participant in the machinery of governance. Her role, however, did not change with any fanfare or formal proclamation. Rather, it evolved as many such things did in the medieval world, through the quiet accumulation of small tasks, subtle acknowledgements, and the invisible consent of those who had the authority to challenge but chose not to. Matters of household management had long been her domain, as befitted her station, but these had expanded to encompass the allocation of court stipends, oversight of royal estates, and the careful distribution of patronage to influential families. Nobles who once sought only the king's ear now found themselves presenting petitions to her, couching their words in deference not merely to her title but to her growing capacity to act upon their requests. The queen's chambers, once the domain of her ladies-in-waiting, tutors, and visiting noblewomen seeking the customary favors of friendship, had transformed into a kind of secondary audience room. On certain days, long lines would form in the outer corridor, composed of minor courtiers, foreign envoys bearing letters from distant lords, and clerics entrusted with the concerns of abbeys or monasteries under royal protection. Within, the queen listened with an attentiveness that surprised some who still remembered her as the small, quiet child first brought from a foreign shore. She had, over the years, absorbed not only the etiquette of conversation, but the subtler arts of negotiation, the deliberate pauses, the measured responses that neither promised nor refused outright, and the careful way of leaving matters open, so that she retained the power to decide at a later time when conditions might be more favorable. Her influence extended beyond the walls of the palace into the broader territories of the realm. When royal revenues from certain provinces lagged, it was the queen who corresponded with the stewards, requesting detailed accounts and suggesting adjustments that reflected both firmness and an awareness of local difficulties. In the realm's religious houses, her patronage was evident in the repair of cloisters, the commissioning of illuminated manuscripts, and the quiet provision of funds to nunneries where daughters of loyal vassals took their vows. Such acts not only strengthened her personal reputation for piety, but also wove a network of gratitude that could be relied upon in times when political currents shifted unpredictably. The courtiers, ever attuned to the subtleties of power, adjusted their behavior accordingly. Those who had once paid her only the courtesies owed to a young queen, now sought her favor with calculated gifts, rare fabrics from distant markets, finely worked devotional objects, or even hawks trained for the hunt. These were not merely tokens of admiration but strategic offerings meant to secure her goodwill in matters both great and small. The queen received them all with a serene composure, accepting the implicit acknowledgement of her position without ever openly claiming a higher role than tradition allowed. Still, there were those who viewed this gradual shift with suspicion. Some among the older nobility whispered that the crown's authority was diluted when it flowed through a queen's hand rather than directly from the king. Foreign observers, particularly those from realms where queens were more tightly confined to ceremonial duties, sometimes expressed mild astonishment in their reports, noting that the lady of the realm seemed to conduct herself with a measure of independence unusual for her age and gender. Yet, in the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that sustained the court, such opinions mattered less than the reality that she was increasingly indispensable to the smooth operation of the kingdom's affairs. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the court's bustle subsided and the corridors grew still, the queen would often walk through the private gardens that adjoined her apartments. There, away from the formalities and careful performances of the day, she could consider the delicate balance she was maintaining. The king's authority still anchored the realm, but each passing month saw more of its weight resting upon her shoulders. It was a responsibility she had not sought in her earliest years, yet the slow passage of time, the constant observation of political life, and the lessons imparted by those who had served before her, had prepared her to bear it without outward strain. Her involvement in governance was not without its challenges. Disputes between noble houses required her to mediate with patience, listening to long recitations of grievances that often stretched back generations. Managing the treasury demanded vigilance against corruption, as well as the foresight to plan for poor harvests or unexpected military expenses. She found that decisions could rarely be made with absolute satisfaction for all parties. Instead, her aim was to ensure that no faction felt so disadvantaged that they would turn their discontent into open defiance. This skill, the art of keeping discontent manageable, was perhaps her most valuable contribution in an era when a single ill-judged decision could provoke rebellion. In time, the Queen's presence in the council chambers became not just accepted, but expected. While she did not preside in the king's stead, her attendance signaled both his trust and her capacity to grasp matters of state. Advisors learned that her questions could be pointed, her memory exacting, and her awareness of court alliances sharp enough to discern the unspoken motives behind each proposal. The fact that she had grown from a child bride into a figure of quiet political competence lent her an authority that even her detractors found difficult to dismiss outright. By the time the king's infirmities became impossible to ignore, the Queen was, for all practical purposes, already sharing in the crown's burdens. The courtiers who gathered in the great hall each morning now waited for her arrival with nearly the same attentiveness they once reserved for him. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of decisions that would be acted upon without delay. Yet this assent, though marked by growing respect, also carried with it the recognition that her position was tied to the king's fragile health and to the uncertainty of what might follow should his reign come to an end. That uncertainty loomed ever larger in the minds of those who depended on the stability she helped maintain. For while she had become the queen in practice as well as in title, the future of the realm would not be shaped by her alone once the inevitable came to pass, a reality that would soon reveal itself as the king's strength faded further, drawing the court into a period of tense anticipation. The death of a king in any age seldom arrived quietly, for even when the final hours passed in a chamber heavy with incense and murmured prayers, the weight of what came next pressed on all who served beneath the crown. His final illness had lingered for weeks, his body failing in increments that were both slow and cruel, and the corridors of the palace had grown accustomed to the muted tread of messengers and the constant presence of physicians who could do little but adjust pillows, offer broths, and recite prayers to saints who, it seemed, had chosen not to intervene. For her, now in her early 20s, yet still young by the standards of rule, the moment was not only the loss of a husband who had been part of her life since childhood, but the shattering of the structure that had defined her place in the world for more than a decade. She had entered these walls as a foreign child, a ceremonial bride with no true duties, and now stood as queen in widow's black, her role abruptly altered, her future uncertain, Outside the palace gates, the city stirred uneasily. Bells tolled in the churches, their deep iron voices rolling across rooftops, over markets, and into narrow alleys where tradesmen paused to cross themselves and peasants in from the countryside looked toward the towers with a mixture of curiosity and fear. For the people, a monarch's death meant a turning of the wheel that could bring change or ruin, depending on how the days ahead unfolded. Rumors moved faster than the tolling bells, whispers of who might claim the throne, which noble families were already gathering allies, and whether the crown's enemies would see an opportunity to press their advantage. The court, always a place of careful steps and guarded words, became almost suffocating in its silence, as though everyone understood that the wrong conversation overheard might shape the kingdom's future. Within the Queen's private apartments, heavy curtains muffled the bright light of day, casting the rooms into a shadowed half-gloom where the scent of beeswax candles mixed with the faint trace of crushed herbs scattered to ward off sickness. Servants moved quietly, speaking in low tones, arranging her mourning attire, and ensuring that every detail of her appearance conveyed dignity and sorrow without a hint of weakness. In these first hours, she was less a person than a symbol, the kingdom's visible expression of grief, and yet, privately, she felt the strange disorientation of one whose life had been tethered to another's will for so long that the sudden absence of it left her suspended, unsure whether to step forward or hold still. The council, a body dominated by men decades older than she, assembled in the great chamber to decide the immediate course of the realm. They spoke in the careful, measured phrases of those who understood the stakes, the preservation of order, the securing of borders, the calming of the people. As Dowager Queen, she held no direct claim to the throne, yet her position carried influence, through alliances formed in her name, through the loyalty of certain courtiers, and through her status as the link to the late king's memory. Envoys from foreign courts, some of whom had once questioned the marriage that brought her here, now sent messages of condolence that were as much political signals as they were expressions of sympathy. The funeral rites would take days to prepare. The king's body, embalmed with the skill of the royal apothecaries, was placed in state beneath the vaulted roof of the cathedral, watched over by guards in ceremonial armor, whose polished steel caught the glow of hundreds of candles. Nobles arrived in black robes lined with fur, their footsteps echoing on the stone floors as they approached to bow before the bier. She stood beside it for long hours, her gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance, her mind filled not with memories of affection, but with the slow parade of obligations now laid upon her. Beyond the ceremonial, there was strategy to be considered. As a young widow, especially one without an heir of her own body, she was vulnerable to the designs of those who saw her as a political prize, a means to secure legitimacy, wealth, or influence. Offers would come, some disguised as gestures of protection, others blunt in their ambition. In the meantime, her income, her estates, and her retainers would all be subject to the decisions of the Regency Council. Every choice she made would be watched, weighed, and either welcomed or condemned by factions she could not always see. In private moments, she walked the gardens, now bare with the approach of winter, and thought of the road that had brought her here, from the foreign halls of her birth to the cold grandeur of this court, from a life shaped entirely by others' arrangements to this strange solitary station. She knew that the coming months would demand patience, caution, and the quiet gathering of allies. Whether she wished it or not, she was still part of the machinery of power, and her survival depended on playing the role assigned to her with the same composure that had carried her through her years as a child bride. And so, as the bells continued their slow tolling, and the banners over the palace hung heavy in the damp air, she prepared to step into the next, more uncertain chapter of her life, one in which her title alone could not shield her, and in which her own actions would for the first time carry the weight of shaping her future. The mourning would last for months, but the struggle to define her place began the moment the crown passed to another head. It was a moment both ending and beginning, the threshold upon which her new role as a widowed queen, no longer merely an ornament of alliance but a figure navigating the dangerous currents of court, truly began to take shape. And with the first days of widowhood came the slow, careful realization that her survival would depend not on grief alone, but on the calculated art of maintaining her relevance in a court that might, in time, wish to forget her entirely. In the weeks following the king's burial, when the last of the black-draped banners were taken down from the palace walls, and the courtiers began, with practiced discretion, to return to their accustomed intrigues, she found herself standing at a crossroads unlike any she had faced before. Widowhood, especially for a queen without a son to anchor her position, was a peculiar and precarious state, one in which she was expected to grieve with dignity, to fade into a respectful quiet, and perhaps to accept a new marriage arranged by those who believed her future was theirs to decide. But beneath the layers of expected sorrow, she felt a flicker of something less submissive, the desire to shape her own existence, to remain a figure of consequence, rather than a relic of the late king's reign. It was a dangerous ambition, for the court had never looked kindly upon women who insisted on wielding influence without the convenient structure of a husband's authority. Her first step toward independence was the securing of her household, a practical matter on the surface, yet deeply political beneath. The estates granted to her as part of her marriage settlement were now under review by the Regency Council, whose members debated whether she should retain control of them or see them absorbed into the crown's revenues. Every acre of land, every tenant's rent, and every chest of coin represented both livelihood and leverage. She sent careful petitions, each phrased with an almost exaggerated humility, yet crafted so that to deny them outright would appear ungenerous, even dishonorable, to the memory of the king. Allies among the nobility spoke in her favor, not always out of loyalty, but because they saw advantage in keeping her as a counterweight to other factions. Money, however, was only part of the equation. Influence was the more subtle prize, and here she was forced to walk a narrow path. The late king's household had been her world for years, but much of it was now being restructured under the authority of the new monarch and his advisors. Positions she had once filled with trusted attendants were quietly reassigned. Access to certain chambers, once freely hers, was now restricted. She responded by gathering around her a smaller, more loyal circle, ladies-in-waiting, clerks and messengers, who owed their positions directly to her patronage, and whose loyalty could be relied upon in the private exchange of letters and information. In these rooms, away from the council's oversight, she began to weave the delicate web of relationships that would sustain her influence. The question of remarriage, inevitable in such circumstances, became a constant undercurrent. Suitors appeared, some noblemen of the realm, others foreign princes, whose proposals arrived by letter, wrapped in the language of alliance, but carrying the sharp edge of political calculation. Each marriage would mean surrendering her autonomy to a new husband's will, becoming once more the instrument of others' strategies. Refusing such offers required both tact and resolve, for outright rejection could be construed as insult, yet too much hesitation might give the impression that she was holding out for an inappropriate match. She learned the art of delay, requesting time to consult family abroad, citing periods of mourning, or feigning illness, until the most pressing threats to her independence were quietly withdrawn. The pressures were relentless. All members of the council hinted that her security would be better assured if she accepted a husband from among their own ranks. The clerics reminded her that the natural order of a woman's life was to be under male guidance. Even her own extended family, writing from her homeland, suggested that a politically advantageous remarriage might be her safest course. Yet she understood what none of them wished to acknowledge aloud, that marriage for her would mean erasure. Whatever measure of authority she could still claim would vanish into the shadow of another man's name. In the months that followed, she turned increasingly to the estates that remained under her control, visiting them in person, a gesture rare for a woman of her rank. She inspected accounts, received petitions from tenants, and oversaw repairs to neglected properties. These journeys were as much political theatre as administration, for each appearance reminded the realm that she was still a figure of substance, capable of commanding respect, without the protection of a husband. Such acts, however, did not go unnoticed by those who feared she was gathering too much independence. Whispers began to circulate, questioning whether her interest in her estates was truly for their betterment, or part of some larger, unspoken design. At court, she relied on the one advantage widowhood afforded her. She could speak from the position of the king's memory, reminding others, subtly but unmistakably, of the trust he had placed in her judgment during his later years. She invoked his name when advocating for the appointment of loyal retainers, when petitioning for the defense of her rights, and when cautioning against decisions that might endanger the stability of the realm. Some found her persistence admirable, others irritating. All understood, however, that she was not a figure to be entirely ignored. The struggle for independence was not a single victory to be won, but a series of small deliberate acts, each estate preserved, each ally maintained, each attempt at forced remarriage deftly avoided. It was a balancing act between visibility and caution, between asserting herself enough to remain relevant and avoiding the appearance of open defiance that might justify stripping her of what she had left. And though the outcome was never certain, each day that passed without her being displaced or diminished was, in its quiet way, a triumph. In the stillness of her private chambers at night, she often considered the irony of her position, a queen in name, yet fighting for the same basic securities as any widow of lesser station, a roof of her own, an income to sustain her, and the right to make her own choices. That she pursued these things not in the shadows, but in full view of a court eager to see her falter, made the effort all the more remarkable. For all the pressures brought to bear against her, she had not yet yielded, and in that persistence lay the faint but vital hope that she could shape a life beyond the role others wished to write for her. In the years that followed her passing, when the rhythm of court life had settled into the habits of a new reign, and her apartments had long since been reassigned to another, her story began the slow transformation from lived experience into recorded history, a process as treacherous and mutable as any intrigue she had faced in life. The chroniclers, who worked under the patronage of kings, noble families, or the church, rarely wrote with pure objectivity. Their quills were guided as much by the expectations of their patrons as by their own recollections. Some who had known her in person, or had served in her household, remembered a woman of intelligence and resolve, capable of navigating the shifting tides of court politics with a measured hand. Others, more inclined to view her through the lens of suspicion reserved for powerful women, painted her as overreaching, calculating, or dangerously ambitious. With each retelling, these impressions hardened into narratives, until the woman herself seemed to disappear beneath the weight of other people's interpretations. Early accounts written within a decade of her death tended to emphasize her piety and devotion, presenting her as a model of queenly conduct during her husband's lifetime, and as a dignified widow thereafter. These portrayals were often less a reflection of her actual behavior than an attempt to set a moral example for other women of rank, reinforcing the virtues of obedience, charity, and quiet endurance. Yet even in these idealized versions, small hints of her political skill occasionally surfaced. The careful choice of words in a treaty, the preservation of certain estates against council interference, the discreet support for allies in the realm. Chroniclers might not have praised these acts outright, but they could not quite erase them either, for too many still remembered her influence to deny it entirely. As decades passed, however, and those who had known her personally were replaced by writers working from hearsay and older manuscripts, her image began to fracture. Some later historians, writing in the service of rulers who had little affection for her family's legacy, cast her in a more critical light. They described her as manipulative, a woman who had meddled in affairs beyond her station, whose resistance to remarriage was interpreted not as an act of independence but as stubbornness bordering on vanity. In these accounts, her efforts to secure her household and income were reframed as greed. Her political alliances became schemes. The living woman, with her private fears, her carefully calculated silences, and her quiet acts of defiance, was replaced by a convenient caricature that suited the purposes of those in power. Yet history is rarely fixed in a single form. Centuries later, as scholars began to revisit the records with a more critical eye, a different version of her life emerged. Letters once tucked away in monastic archives revealed her direct involvement in estate management, her correspondence with foreign dignitaries, and her careful navigation of the treacherous balance between visibility and survival in court life. The rediscovery of these documents began to shift the narrative. No longer was she merely a passive figure defined by her marriage, nor a schemer grasping for influence without cause. but rather a capable and determined woman whose actions were shaped by the limited choices available to her. In some quarters, this re-evaluation was embraced as a welcome correction, a recognition of her as an individual who had operated with as much agency as her position allowed. In others, it provoked unease, for it challenged the familiar stories that had been repeated for generations, and so her memory continued to be contested, not in the same immediate personal way it had been during her lifetime, but in the subtler arena of historical interpretation, where the stakes were no less significant. For to redefine her was also to redefine the role of women in the politics of her era, and to admit that the neat moral lessons of earlier chronicles had always been a simplification. By the time her life had been set down in modern histories, her name carried both the shadow of controversy and the glint of admiration. Tour guides in old palaces might describe her with a mixture of respect and intrigue. Scholars might debate the true extent of her influence, and novels or plays might reimagine her as either heroine or antagonist, depending on the storyteller's aim. The truth, as always, was more elusive, existing somewhere between the idealized queen, the maligned schemer, and the practical, determined woman who had fought, quietly and persistently, for her independence. In this way, her legacy remained alive, not in a single fixed image, but in the ongoing conversation about who she had been and what her life had meant. The real woman, the one who had once stood in candlelit halls making choices under the watchful eyes of those who might use them against her, was forever out of reach. But the persistence of her story, altered, debated, and reinterpreted across centuries, was itself a kind of victory, for to be remembered, even imperfectly, was to resist the oblivion that had claimed so many others. In the end, her story, with all its silences, its careful negotiations, and its long stretches of quiet endurance, stands as more than just the tale of one queen's life. It is a window into the machinery of medieval politics, where marriages were less the meeting of hearts than the binding of treaties, where the exchange of a dowry could secure decades of uneasy peace, and where a young girl's education in languages, faith, and etiquette was in truth a training in survival. Her experiences reveal how the ambitions of kingdoms could be stitched into the fabric of a single wedding gown, how the smiles offered at courtly feasts might conceal rivalries as sharp as any blade, and how power for women, when it existed at all, was rarely granted openly, but had to be coaxed into being through patience, calculation, and the art of appearing harmless until the right moment came. Beneath the rituals, the jeweled crowns, and the solemn processions, there was the constant human cost, the forfeiting of childhood to duty, the sacrifices made in silence, and the constant vigilance required to avoid becoming a casualty of the very alliances she embodied. Her life reminds us that the medieval court was not simply a place of splendor, but a stage upon which each gesture, each word, was weighed and remembered, and where the line between security and ruin was no thicker than a whispered accusation. And perhaps this is her final legacy, that centuries later, her name still drifts through history not only as a queen, but as a testament to the resilience it took to live within walls that glittered with gold yet echoed with the quiet, enduring price of power, a reminder that behind every polished chronicle lies the unrecorded heartbeat of a life lived in the shadow of a crown.